Hello. I'm Ardi Danielovich, and this is How to Build a Brand, the podcast that demystifies marketing, advertising, and all things content. Today we have Jack Howard.
Hello.
The writer, director, genuine podcaster, not fake podcaster. Jack, we've worked together for a while now.
Yeah.
I have a personal man crush on you.
It's reciprocal.
Is it mutual?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm glad it's mutual. Jack, so good to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
You are a genuine. When we first talked about this podcast, How to Build a Brand, someone like yourself who essentially does storytelling and creates storytelling and is a content producer and who's someone who's genuinely built an audience over the last few years. Like, this is exactly what we've built this podcast for, which is basically to get in the mind of people like you and to give our audience, the ambitious entrepreneur, the entrepreneurial business person looking to build their own audience and looking to build their own brand. We want to get inside your mind. And thank you. Yeah, we're going to climb in today. So how you doing?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you, mate. It's weird to even hear you sort of describe what I've done. And even when you say like, oh, you've built an audience over the last few years, when I think about it, I'm like, well, it's not like a few years. I've been doing this basically more than half my life now. I started making stuff when I was 16. I'm turning 32 on Sunday. So like it's a long time to have been doing it. So it's a very, very strange thing to even talk about it and try and contextualize how this happened, because it was basically a lot of different factors that I some of them I didn't have control over, obviously, like timing and luck and the fact that YouTube and things like that was so new when I was so young. Like all of those kind of things to play a part in all of this.
So what were you doing? So you were 16. YouTube was
a baby.
A baby.
Yeah. It did feel though at the time like it was just a thing that had been around for, and then when everyone found out that it only existed from 2005, it was like, what? Because
surely no one really knew what was going on YouTube.
Not really. But I started like just being a viewer of people on there, and there used to be like a different way of structuring the website where creators would get featured and things like that, and there'd just be a person picking which creator should be on the front page. Wow. Obviously now it's obviously, all algorithmic and everything else. So it was much easier then to like find the newer people who were making interesting stuff. And people really were. So yeah, I was just kind of inspired. I always wanted to be a filmmaker. I can't remember when I didn't want to do something creative, whether that was acting or whatever. But then I started to see that people were just making stuff on YouTube and just putting it out there. And I was like, I want to have a go at that. It was literally as simple as that, and then it snowballed, and I'm obviously skipping ahead, but it snowballed, and then accidentally it became a job for 10 years.
And so just let's fast forward to now, and then let's go back. But so now, just tell us. We're doing
this like a Nolan structure.
Exactly, and you love Nolan. This is Christopher Nolan's biggest fan. Is that right here?
I think I'm definitely in the top 10.
So just tell us, okay, right now, just give me some stats in terms of like your audience and your following, and the various platforms that you have audiences on. I'm
being genuine. I'm not trying to be modest. I don't actually know the specific figures. It's not something I keep an eye on. But on Instagram, I think it's probably around 230,000 followers or something like that is what I can imagine it probably is. On YouTube, combined with, I was part of a comedy duo called Jack and Dean, as well as my own channel. The combined amount of views on there is probably around 100 million views from the stuff that I've made specifically. Subscribers wise, sort of around the sort of 600, 700,000 mark. But it's not something that I'm quite active with anymore on YouTube. I've kind of decided a few years ago that I was going to take a step away from doing all that kind of thing to try and actively pursue full-time being a director for hire and trying to sort of build up my career that way without having to rely on also being on camera as well, because it was starting to become a bit exhausting to try and balance both. Although I think it's helpful to have done both.
So that's why I find you and your career particularly interesting, is because you are both a personal brand in yourself, Jack Howard, but you also are working on behalf of brands, and you and I have collaborated on a number of projects for commercial businesses, and we help businesses grow their own brands through communications and creating content, all these sort of things. So okay, so basically you're in a position where you have built a large audience online over the last 16 or so years, let's say.
Bizarre.
So it is mental.
Yeah.
And so 16-year-old Jack, you're messing around in your bedroom, presumably, and just starting to film stuff. Tell us, how does it go from there? How does it go from YouTube is, no one knows what the hell YouTube is. You're watching some YouTube videos whilst everyone else is presumably out playing sports and running around and studying.
What my dad would have preferred me to do.
Yeah. So you're sat in a dark room watching YouTube to suddenly you've got 100 million views across various different platforms, and you're directing for some of the world's biggest brands.
Yeah. So
how do you go from that to that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't actually know the answer to that, but I can try and tell you the story.
Plus, by the way, also, you do a podcast with Mark Kermode.
Yes. Yeah. Well, yes, that's kind of on a hiatus, but hopefully we'll be coming back at some point. So when I started making stuff, I was more inspired by editing. I was seeing that people on YouTube were kind of making fan edits of things, and that was kind of my gateway into making stuff. So the first thing I ever put on YouTube was a fan edit that I did of a Spider-Man 3 trailer, where I took the 90s cartoon and I put the audio from Spider-Man 3's trailer underneath it, so it looked like the cartoon was saying what the real movie was saying. And that is still, and this is hilarious and borderline embarrassing to admit, the most popular single video I've ever put on the internet. And I uploaded it, I think, when I was 15 in like May of 2007 or something like that. And it's got like nearly 5 million views or something like that. It's just like, it's bonkers. And so I started doing that and did more things like it. I did a Family Guy crossover with Pirates of the Caribbean edit. I did lots of any sort of combination of things I could do. I was just being creative and just being a kid and playing, actually.
Right.
And then eventually got bored of using other people's footage, and I was like, I want to have a go at filming my own stuff, and started filming stuff on my mobile phone. And it was back in the time when, cameras on phones weren't good, and actually getting them off your phone to your computer was difficult. So I had to use a converting software that still had the brand, in the middle of the footage that I just decided to ignore, and just so I could edit my footage because it was the only way of getting it on my computer. Kept doing that, and in school, ran into, I mentioned I was part of a comedy duo called Jack and Dean. When we were in maths class, about 15 or 16, that's when I met Dean Dobbs for the first time. We just bonded because he told me my Green Day sticker for the American Idiot album that I had on my planner. He said they're a shit band. And I said, name a better band then. And he said Panic at the Disco, who are arguably more shit. And but then the next day I came in having listened to Panic at the Disco on his recommendation, and I slammed my hand. Can I swear on this podcast? Is that okay?
Do what you like.
I slammed my hands down on his desk and I went, I fucking love Panic at the Disco. And that was the start of a beautiful friendship. And he was working on some other stuff with another friend of ours from school. They were just making this silly little comedy series together, and I started working with him on making it into a movie version of that. And me and him wrote together and would always try and make each other laugh. And the movie didn't happen, obviously. We filmed some scenes, but we were 16 years old at this point and nothing got finished. But we liked that we could make these little scenes together. So we decided to start a new YouTube channel where we would just do sketches. So we were like, okay, instead of trying to do a feature film at this time, let's maybe see if we can get lots of little ones done.
Yeah, okay.
And that kind of snowballed over the course of the 5 years or so. So we went to university, kept making stuff, and then after university we wandered into BBC Radio 1 and worked there for a couple of years. We also worked with an American network that was owned by AT&T at the time. It doesn't exist anymore, called Fullscreen, and they basically commissioned us to make 2 series of a show. Basically our own sitcom. It was called Jack and Dean of All Trades. The concept was us trying to kind of keep that looseness that we had in our sketch comedy, which is that Jack and Dean can kind of be in any scenario and kind of transcend genres and things like that, which I always like doing, especially as a filmmaker, to sort of play on the different genres that I liked. And it was basically, the concept was the Chuckle Brothers. It was every episode Jack and Dean get a different job, but it wasn't about the jobs. It was okay, how does they explore these different ideas? And Jessica Hynes was in it, and she's from Spaced. She wrote that with Simon Pegg, and we wrote this role thinking of her, but thinking no way we'd ever get her. And then she read it and liked it and did it for 2 series. Mental stuff that happened.
So this was a proper TV.
Yes,
this was
yeah.
this. I say proper TV
yeah,
shows
yeah,
if like
yeah.
YouTube's.
So it was for an American network, and it basically had the budget that's comparable to something like a BBC Three sitcom, essentially.
Wow.
So it was like a decent sized thing that I got to make at the age of 23, 24, 25 or something like that.
Crazy.
That I was the director of, the writer, the editor. Like I basically was wearing all the different hats to make this show. That then that was a basic full screen was basically a streaming service that they were trying to make, sort of using sort of people who had online followings and seeing if their following would follow them to a different place like that.
Yeah.
It didn't work because these things don't work, and I knew that at the time. That collapsed. We ended up putting that back on our channel for free, so that's where it exists now, which I'm very happy about. And then after working together for 10 years and actually coinciding with 2020, you know, where the situation happened, me and Dean kind of had been, not for any bad reason, but kind of drifting apart a little bit.
Right.
And I think it's because we'd signed up to a professional marriage when we were teenagers and didn't really understand what that was going to mean. So for that 10 years, we were constantly going to America, going to conventions over there, making shows, like writing pilots, trying to get things made, making our own stuff constantly. We were combined as a brand, as Jack and Dean, and we were on Radio 1, like all this sort of stuff that was mad to happen within those years, that we hadn't officially ever gone, this is what we're going to do, and these are our goals. We're just rolling with it as it was happening. So I think actually coinciding with 2020 and when we all had to be by ourselves, it kind of worked for me and Dean to sort of just drift apart a little bit.
Did you find how do you find that affected your personal brand or your identity as Jack Howard as an individual, as opposed to Jack and Dean?
Yeah, I'd always done well because I think I was always a bit more driven to make stuff than Dean was. So I was always making stuff on my own channel and with other people anyway. So I directed for other YouTubers, sketches and things like that. And I was always kind of around doing stuff. So in that sense, not too much. But in a different sense, creatively, me and Dean, you know the way that, you a match and the match box, like creating fire, like I was like, I'm just a match without the matchbox. This is a really bad metaphor, but like there was nothing to create a spark anymore.
Okay.
Like it was always that we would bounce off of each other. So now it was only on me, or I was trying to find that somewhere else. And two combinations are always going to be different. You're always going to get a different outcome. So there's something about the way that me and Dean work with each other, the way that we can make each other laugh, that is kind of irreplaceable. And I kind of just had to accept that that was the case. That we may make stuff together again at some point. There's no guarantee of anything. But when I'm sort of now thinking about my own creative work and how I'm going to go forward, I'm just accepting that it's a different way of working than it was before. But yeah, in terms of my own personal brand of stuff, I think I was already aware that I had like a separate identity anyway, that people didn't just say it's Jack from Jack and Dean. Like they also knew of me from other stuff. And because of things like making the podcast with Mark Kermode, people knew me as this movie guy as well as somebody who made comedy. Actually, that sort of makes sense actually to tell you that because I'd sort of become, especially in the UK, one of the sort of leading content creators who talked about movies, that took the eye of Mark Kermode, and then he like invited me to make a show with him. Like that's bonkers that happened.
Tell me how that happened, because I love you. We know each other.
But Mark Kermode is a different beast.
Exactly. As someone who loves movies and loves being a bit of a nerd around movies, like obviously Mark Kermode is the UK's leading film critic. How the hell did you end up on a podcast with him?
So I was working at Radio 1 at the time, and we had this monthly show that Dean and I would do. And randomly, one day I got a DM on Twitter from Mark Kermode.
Did he DM you?
He just DM'd me. When I tell the story, he doesn't remember it, but I've got receipts, so I can show you the screenshots. He DM'd me saying, "Hey Jack, my son is a big fan of what you do," or whatever, something like that.
I see.
"Would you be okay with me bringing him into Radio 1 and showing him around and meeting you?" And I was just like, hi, Mark Kermode. Yes, of course. Like, would you also like to do a little guest spot on our show? And he was like, yeah, if you don't mind, like an old man coming onto your young person's show or whatever he'd said. Unfortunately, his son couldn't make the day, but Mark still came on and did this like spot with me and Dean on the radio. And actually there was a moment when Mark and I were going back and forth on movies and Dean was like, guys, I'm still here. Like, it was a bit funny just to see that we'd immediately got a bit of chemistry about something. Yeah. And then it was around 2015, because I remember the first time that I met Mark's son, it was in line for the screening of Star Wars The Force Awakens.
Right.
Because I arrived and Mark was at the front of the queue, because basically when these screenings happen, especially, I don't know if they happen as much anymore, but like for Star Wars and anything new Marvel, when it was a screening and it was in the IMAX in Leicester Square, there'd be a queue of people for at least an hour, because they know that when they're let in, the seats are a free-for-all.
Right.
And that's a big screen, so you don't want to be at the front. So there was always a snake of people there. And we arrived, and Mark was at the front. And to be fair, there was only about 20 people in the queue, but Mark just shouted, Jack! And then beckoned me over to the front of the queue.
That's the and I was like, you were like, I know I've made it now.
And I was like, no one's going to tell Mark Kermode not to queue him. And his son was with him, and we got chatting and things like that. We sat and watched the new Star Wars together, which was very, very special. And then after that, we just stayed in touch. We'd see each other at things. Sometimes we'd go to the pub together afterwards and talk about stuff. And then one day he just invited me onto his he used to do a YouTube show called Kermode on Cut, where he just basically just riff about whatever he wanted to talk about. And he invited me onto that. And then after we'd finished that episode, I was putting on my coat and he said, we should make a show together. And I was like, yeah, all right, Mark. And he was like, no, I'm not being facetious. We should make a show together. And I was like, okay, sure. Like, I would love to do that. And, kind of expecting that it was him just saying a nice thing. But then it happened. And that was like middle of 2018. And then by the end of 2018, we just started. And it was very strange all of a sudden. And then that continued for 3 years or so before. I don't want to get into all of like why it had to stop, but it was essentially because of Mark leaving the BBC and starting the podcast more independently. He couldn't have that podcast we were doing continue, which was a shame. But again, like I say, fingers crossed, it might make a return.
So,
I owe it to Mark's son basically for being a fan of the stuff I'd made on YouTube, as to why Mark paid attention.
But I guess what I'm hearing from all this is that you don't. It certainly seems that you're not scared to put stuff out there into the kind of ether, what people would in the industry, in the advertising industry, would describe as content.
Yes.
And it feels like it's a horrible word, but it's basically the word.
It is now the word, yes.
This whole thing is about how to build a brand, and there'll be people listening to this, not many, but there'll be a few people listening to this that kind of go, okay, well, I run a business and I'm really brilliant at running a business, but I'm not brilliant at building a brand. And I know that I should be producing quote unquote content for my business, but I'm too scared to do a podcast, film some content, put a post out there. I'm getting the sense from you that good things happen if you just start small. It doesn't matter where you start, just start putting content out there, and who knows what gets picked up.
Massively.
And like how much, talking about that content, then how much are you thinking about like what might get picked up versus what actually ends up getting picked up? Like, have you had any surprises where you go, I'll just put this thing out there, and you don't think it's going to go particularly well, and then it becomes the most viewed thing you've done, or is there something you think it's going to generate loads of views and it's going to be really engaged with, and it kind of goes out there and no one's interested in it? Like,
I've had both.
Tell us about that. Like, what's that? What does that process look like?
Well, first of all, I would definitely say that there is something to just doing stuff, and especially now when actually the internet on all platforms is so cluttered and is so full of stuff and is so full of a constant stream of it. Like, there's a constant stream of content and it's there. There's something new every second.
Yeah. So how do you cut through that?
Exactly. Yeah. So there's something very intimidating about that. So there's something about how when I started, it was kind of the Wild West, and it was this uncharted territory, and we were the kids who were coming in and just like going, we're just making stuff and we're talking to our cameras, and it's the nerds in their bedrooms like speaking to each other through the internet and doing video blogs. Like at this time, people were like, who are these weirdos? And now everybody has got a camera in their hand or they're filming on their phone all the time. it can be very intimidating, I think. And even it's so weird to be describing myself this way at 30, but like 32, as a veteran of the internet. Even I look at it now and go, what do I have to add to this? How does my voice, me making something on here, contribute something that isn't already being spoken about or isn't already being made in some capacity? But that's only my like inner critic brain being like, you don't have anything of worth to say in this situation that somebody isn't already saying. And I think at the moment feel a little bit intimidated by even potentially coming back and making stuff on the internet. I know that I personally, though, whenever I make anything, I just feel better having made something. And I think that it does help to basically just like keep, even if it's not your finest work, it's helpful, I think, to just let people know that you're still here and you're still around to keep them in your mind. Like I know, for example, most recently I directed a few episodes of a CBBC show, right? And I put up a post with some screenshots from that, and I was in one of the scenes, which was quite helpful because especially on my own personal Instagram, I noticed that if I'm not in something, people don't really pay attention.
That's interesting.
Which is very interesting, isn't it? Because like I would hope that people care about something I've made no matter what, but actually what I found, and this is strange for me to even sort of wrap my head around, that if my face isn't in something, people are less likely to pay attention. Very odd thing to sort of wrap your head around. But then immediately after I put that up, I got an email from somebody being like, oh, I saw you directed this, and like offered me like to talk about something that they were doing. And that's just like, and I was nervous about putting up a post about that. I don't know why, but I just kind of was. But actually immediately afterwards, literally within half an hour, I got an email from somebody who had seen it asking if I wanted to come and help them make something together.
Right, okay.
So even by just getting past that weird little idea that like, oh, no one's going to care about this or whatever, immediately there was a
snowball effect starts happening, and something
I think if
else.
you just do that more often,
the
more you are just like letting people know you're there and you're doing something.
The other thing that's interesting in what you said there is that you start to pick up like data points in terms of like what works and what doesn't work. And again, I'm just thinking, if you're building a brand, you're trying to build a brand, you're thinking, okay, well, what content should I put out there? Putting a number of different pieces of content out there and going, okay, well, actually the one that's got me in it is performing 50% better. Let's start doing more with me in it. Like that's going to start to create some more interest, some more engagement. But unless you experiment and are comfortable with experimenting, you're never gonna nail it in one video or one post or whatever, are you?
I've kept up, apart from a couple that I was like just a bit embarrassed by that I wanted to get rid of. Every single video I've ever made is on the internet. And even some of the ones that I am embarrassed by them when I was a teenager. But just anyway,
tell us about that embarrassing one.
No, there's more than one. But what I'm saying is that like I like that if somebody wanted to see that like eventually, hopefully, I will make something that I'm extremely proud of on a big budget level. That's like a big goal that they could trace back to. Oh, this is where he started, and like the kind of stuff I was making when I was a kid that isn't good, and that's actually a part of it as well, isn't it? Like making stuff, you're never just going to nail it on the first go, like you just said. You need to trial and error it, and what's I guess difficult about doing that on the internet is that you're doing it potentially to an audience of people who can see you fail. But I think it's important to sort of work those kinks out so you can figure out what it is that you have to offer, what you can do that's different to everything else. But I'm also needing to take my own advice at the moment, especially because I've stopped making stuff for myself because it feels intimidating.
Yeah. Okay.
So I can understand that. I can really understand why somebody would be intimidated to put their stuff out there.
But the advice is start creating and just trial and error, create as much stuff as possible, and you will start to see what people respond to, and then you can start to put more kind of effort or interest behind
it also sort of builds a muscle in a way that like I remember making stuff. YouTube gives you all the analytics for everything,
right?
And probably more so now than I'm even aware of,
right?
But you can see where people mostly are watching it, where people are dropping off, what is the most popular part of the video. You can see it's very interesting as well. Like you're watching the retention line of a video, and when it gets to like the credits or whatever, you can just see the retention line just go bang and just like immediately drop. But then you can also see like what jokes and stuff they like the most, and what and then the comments are telling you what how they're quoting, especially when I did scripted comedy. They're quoting certain jokes, so then it's not like I was going, oh, they like that kind of thing, I'm going to do that next time.
Yeah.
It's not like an active thought, but it built this kind of muscle of understanding how people kind of respond to things. And, you know, if they're going to cut off at the end of the video, I'll make the ending shorter. Or almost wondering if I'm putting a joke into a script, that's going to get quoted a lot. Like just having those kind of instincts as to how an audience is going to respond. So now when I'm directing stuff for, you know, a musician, or if I'm directing an ad for a brand or whatever, I feel like I have these instincts that I can use to help them sort of create the best piece of work, especially if it's going to be used on the internet, which a lot of the time now obviously is for things like Instagram and TikTok and whatever else. It's not really actually a lot of stuff that's being plugged specifically for television now. I feel like I have a good instinct on how an audience will, what I describe as whether they'll accept it or reject it. Because I can almost taste it. It's almost like it's like a understanding flavors. Like I'm just like I just feel like an audience is going to push against this, or if they're going to embrace it. You know, it's something you can only learn by doing.
Okay, well that's really interesting as well, because I think the first side is like, oh, I'm a bit conscious of whether anyone's going to be interested in this. Maybe I'll just put something out there and it'll get 5 views, and you know who cares about what my perspective or point of view is on something. I guess the other view is I don't want to put anything out there that might damage my brand or my brand, my business, my personal brand. Is there any scenarios that you can remember where you've put something out there that people have backlashed against, and you've lost followers as a result of that, or is that an overblown fear that people have?
I think it's overblown unless it's really significant as a choice. But I sort of, like, at first when I was making my own personal YouTube videos, I kind of saw myself more as like a comedian than anything else. So I was making videos that the intention was like, if I think this is funny, and I was always doing like stand-up video, you know what I mean? I was like almost performing to the camera and like doing bits for my own amusement. And then I started to like transition more and more into like more film kind of talk and be more specifically in that kind of area. And that basically moved my audience along. And some people who weren't there for that, who were there for more of the typical kind of YouTuber vibe, they kind of fell away, but new people arrived. And that kind of happened over time. It didn't like hurt me as a creator.
Yeah.
It more just sort of let people who weren't that bothered drift away, and more people who were interested arrive. So it was about that, but that was just a shift in what I was doing. That's what I can remember in terms of feeling that some people were moving on or coming back or whatever. Like that's where I can feel there was a shift happening. I think as long as you're making something for your brand or for yourself that is authentic, then I think that is the most important part. And authentic can mean anything, but as long as it feels like it's coming from a truthful place for you. My favorite example at the moment is Ryanair's TikTok, which is clearly being ran by some like Gen Z employee who's just been given the reins to it. And it's just bonkers. And I love what I love about it. And I think what a lot of people love about it is that I can't believe someone's let them get away with that. Like someone's just let their own employee
100%
just kind of take the piss, and it's made it such a better, like, I like Ryanair because of it. And I think that's a big part of it a lot of the time as well, is when we were making branded stuff on our YouTube channel, like when we're doing collaborations, like people were sponsoring our sketches and things like that, a lot of the time I would try and tell the brand, people are going to think it's cool that you're doing this with us, right? We don't need to shove it down their throats. People are going to like you because you're allowing us to make something that we wouldn't have got to make without you. And you're part of that. And I think
that's why your perspective on stuff is so interesting, because you have a lot of big brands want to create an audience and are striving to create an online audience. You've come at it from the other end, where you have out of nowhere just created an audience for yourself of people that are interested in what you've got to say and is authentic, as you say. Whereas suddenly a brand just kind of going, okay, well, I'm going to create a YouTube channel, I'm going to start putting content out there that's inauthentic, and that it just shoves my logo down your throat. Of course people aren't interested, and I think that's why you're such a good, you balance that thing of storytelling with the authenticity that I think most big brands really struggle with.
I think the most dangerous thing that a brand could maybe do, and it happens a lot, especially in the bigger brands of things, especially when they're trying to make social content, there's like a guidebook or something of like, or like research that they do about how long videos can be, what they can be. Like, it's bonkers to me, because I think the stuff that actually ends up doing well is the most unpredictable, the least structured. I think those rules are helpful to an extent, like any rule, especially in creativity. It's good to know them. But I think in this world, if you abide by those rules too much, people know that there are these guidebooks that you're kind of abiding by.
Yeah.
So, you know, if your brand is going to be making these one take, if you've got like quite a calm presence and you're talking about something, somebody might really enjoy that calm presence. But if you're making something that's like, hey, how you doing? That's a little bit like, look at me, grabbing attention, and that can be very off-putting.
Yeah.
But also if your authentic presentation is to be a bit more lively, then that's great. But if you are more of a calm person, like there was a few years ago, or maybe a year or so ago, there was like an Irish shop. I can't remember what they sold, but it was something. I mean, obviously, it would be better if I could remember it, because it would mean it was good for the brand. But it was like this Irish guy who like sold shoes or something, and he just did a tour of his shop. But he was such a calm man; it went massively viral and did really well for their brand. Do you know what I mean? Like, you never can kind of predict what it's going to be, and I think there's an authenticity, because that could have just failed.
But I think that's the advantage for a lot of small businesses, isn't it?
Massively.
And entrepreneurs, because I mean, we obviously both work with we work with startups, scale-ups, but also large corporations and bigger brands. And I think there is so many parameters that they put creativity and content through that often what comes out the other side is, as you say, inauthentic or not particularly interesting to an average consumer. I think the big win for smaller brands and smaller businesses is to experiment more, because no one's going to tell you, no, you shouldn't be doing this.
Yes.
Put it out there, test and learn, experiment with it, and who knows one of your videos might go absolutely viral, but and it might be the one that you didn't think would be particularly successful.
Yes, but you can't predict this stuff.
But that's the bet. I think that's really interesting and really kind of empowering, I think, for small businesses, because you look at shiny bits of content that big brands put out there, and you think, oh, I could never be in that position. And even us coming here today, you know, you were looking. We came and sat in the studio. It's being recorded, looks nice and shiny. Hello, and you know. This is not even when you did the podcast with Kermode. Yeah. You sat on Zoom. It was during COVID, and you banged it out on Zoom. Yeah. And it went massively, not quite viral, but you know, it had a massive audience.
It's a good following. Like literally, I would say 50% of the people who will stop me on the street, which doesn't happen a lot, but when it does, I'd say 50% of them are, I love that podcast with Mark
But it's incredible,
Kermode.
and it just shows that like stuff doesn't have to be super polished. It can be a bit scrappy.
Yep.
It can just be, you know, if you've got an interesting perspective on something and you're authentic about it, people will respond well to that. Often, as you say, better than they'll respond to the kind of shiny,
I think
big
the shiny
stuff
can, especially, you know, in today's modern world, shiny stuff can be very off-putting. It can feel, I think a lot of people are used to the language now. I think people are becoming more sophisticated when it comes to media language.
Right.
So if you're trying to manipulate an audience to think a certain thing about a certain brand because of their shiny content, people can taste it. And I think if you're a little bit more raw, I think that can be in your advantage. And actually, as a filmmaker as well, I think some of the best stuff I've ever made is from having constraints. Right. Like being boxed in. I actually think that's probably true of most filmmakers. That you work better within the parameters of like, well, actually, this is all you can afford, or actually, this is all the time you have, or you can only have this many people. When actually the idea, you're like, oh, it'd be so much better if it was this. But then when you have to crunch it down into this, actually, it has to be this way, it actually turns out to be much more interesting, because you're having to be creative to think about how you're going to solve those problems. And I think it's the same thing here, that if you can't afford a big shiny ad, okay, well, what can you do then? Yeah. Like, how can you get what you want to get out there in a different kind of way? And that's going to force you to think more creatively.
So you talk about 16 years ago, you started YouTube. No one knew what YouTube was.
Yeah, sure.
You say that's gone now in terms of all the platforms are well established. Is that true, or is there still opportunities to grow quite quickly an audience on TikTok, let's say, or LinkedIn? You know, what's the landscape like in terms of social media platforms now? And is there? I guess I'm asking: is there any cheats? Is there any? Because clearly there was a cheat for YouTube. The cheat code for YouTube was Be early, and they will promote you.
Yeah. That never happened to us though. That was weird. Like we kind of missed that boat. But what I'm saying is that like we were still early on the platform.
Yeah.
We were still kind of defining what it was at that time. And even I think there are people who will be even earlier than I who will argue against that I wasn't part of the first generation. I was probably part of the second or third.
Yeah. Okay.
But I was, from 2010 to 2015. That was like our time.
Yeah.
And it's
where's that now? Is there a space online now where there's still opportunity to build up audiences quite quickly?
Absolutely everywhere. And I think as well that TikTok is built around the For You page, which is basically an algorithm that's going to show you new stuff all the time. And even if you don't have the biggest audience, I see some stuff come up that I can't believe when I look at the likes has over 1 million likes. I'm like, this is actually bonkers that this sort of stuff is getting this much interaction. But then there's also stuff that I come across that other people won't see that has maybe 4,000 interactions or maybe a few hundred interactions, but I see these people all the time. There's this one guy that I'm watching at the moment who's just posting about him trying to get better. Like he suffers from anxiety and depression, and he's just making videos for himself so he can keep a diary for himself to try and get better. Not many people know who this guy is, but I see him most days. And like, if that was your brand and you were just doing that and it was still over, 500 people were seeing you every day, that's just going to grow and grow and grow and grow. And it's because he's doing it for himself, obviously, for mental health reasons to keep better. But he's posting every single day and he's just in my feed, so I'm aware of who this person is. But if your brand was doing that,
consistency point,
absolutely. And
you've got to be there for people. It's a bit like the coffee shop thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, if a coffee shop opens on Mondays and Tuesdays, and then you go there, and then you come back on Wednesday and it's closed, you're like, oh, I'll go somewhere else. I'll find my other. People want a certain level of consistency.
Yeah, and I actually was reminded yesterday. There's these again classic YouTubers called Rhett and Link. They're American,
right? And
they've been on YouTube since like 2006.
Okay.
So like a long time. And they do this morning show on YouTube. It's like a 20-minute podcast, visual podcast. And they've been doing that probably for about 10 or so years now. And every single one of their videos gets over 1 million views.
Wow.
Every single day.
Wow.
And I actually was just reminded of them because I hadn't thought about them for a little while. I was like, oh, I wonder what they're doing. Saw that is still very much a big popular show, and I was like, of course it is, because this is something that people watch with their morning coffee or with their cereal or whatever. It's part of 1 million plus people's routine every single day is to like watch this thing, and the consistency of that is what has sustained it for as long as it's been going. And I personally, the way I think about making stuff, that's not what I'm striving for. I'm striving personally for, I want to be a filmmaker who puts out a movie one day and then a few years later puts out another one, or is part of a TV series. I'm sort of thinking about people like Donald Glover, who like isn't he's a huge brand, like as a person, he's exactly who that is. He's an actor. He's also Childish Gambino, which is a separate kind of brand within his brand. Yeah. He's somebody who made Atlanta, but he's also in Han Solo. He also played Simba in the Lion King remake, but now he's just done the Mr. and Mrs. Smith reboot. Like, he's all over the place doing stuff that's always got a certain quality to it that I appreciate. But the way he makes stuff is like, it's about quality, not quantity. And I love that. But there's some things where quantity is the thing. Like, the more you do it, the more you're in people's faces, the more people are likely to sort of like stick with it, and you'll become part of their life in a way that they won't even have chosen. You'll just be there. And I think that's a really good thing for a new brand especially to be doing, is just be there all the time.
Okay, interesting. And what are the differences? Like, so obviously you have an audience, so that spans YouTube, Instagram. How do YouTube, Instagram, Facebook and TikTok audiences, how do they differ? Are they different? Is it the same people across all channels?
I imagine there's some crossover.
Are there differences though? What are the sort of broad differences?
I think that on YouTube it's different because it's people who are looking to see the things that you've made, and on Instagram it's the people who are like interested in keeping up with what you're doing.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like so there's some people who might not follow me on Instagram who will follow me on YouTube because they're not bothered about like a picture of me and my girlfriend at Winter Wonderland.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? But there's also people on there as well who may not watch my YouTube stuff, but are like fellow filmmakers who see the kind of thing I'm up to as well, and like, you know, who I'm working with, what I'm up to, that kind of stuff. So all of them are a bit different.
Do you think that small businesses and entrepreneurs should tailor their content specifically to each channel, and like what is that, what
massively,
and how what would that look like?
My least favorite thing is when something that's clearly made for one platform is put on the other. Sometimes
so you see the TikTok logo that goes
on for example, like, and I think that it's okay to put, you know, I've put, you know, a reel on Instagram and the same thing on TikTok, but I've even slightly edited them differently, knowing that they're going to be on different platforms. And it's minor little differences, but I think that, again, it's part of finding whatever your specific voice is, what your authentic kind of voice is, using that on each platform. Like, I think it's probably the same as like when I was looking to become a filmmaker, and like finding things that I personally resonated with, like styles that I resonated with or whatever. And it's kind of how I'm looking at, I'm making a short film at the moment, and actually to make a short film, you've kind of got to build a brand around that as well at the moment. It's kind of part of the deal. So it's got to have its own Instagram page. So I'm looking at how other short films have branded their Instagrams that I've liked, and I'm going to model it off of that. So I suppose the advice there would be like, look at brands that you like, that you are enjoying the stuff that they're posting, and that you genuinely, not that you're going, oh, that looks really professional, or that looks really good, but stuff that you're looking at going, I really like this for some reason, and try and model it off of that in some way. I think that's very helpful as a starting point.
I think that's really good advice. And I think, you know, as creatives, often we look for inspiration in other areas, and
massively.
You mood board things, you copy things from different industries, different categories. And I think that's another piece of empowering advice, really, because it's like, if I didn't know that was an okay thing to do, to look at other categories and go, oh, hang on a minute, another category is doing this, and they're using this particular angle on content in this way. If I didn't know it was okay to copy them, I wouldn't do that. But I think it's that is the big secret in a way of our industry, and I guess it's not called copying; it's called referencing
or inspiration.
Yeah. I'm not saying, you know, copy, you know,
plagiarism is bad.
Yeah, plagiarism is bad.
Don't do that.
But like being inspired by, especially if it's in other categories, and, you know, like take filmmaking. We've talked about this, but like obviously Joker, the movie, you know, from a few years ago, heavily inspired by Scorsese's work from the 70s.
Of course.
And you can't look at Joker and go, this is an entirely original piece of work.
Yeah, it's the same thing as like whenever people talk about Interstellar, the first thing I always ask is, have you seen 2001: A Space Odyssey? It's the first thing I'll always ask, because if they say how much they enjoy Interstellar, I'm like, I feel like you don't know where it's coming from.
Exactly.
So it's things like that it happens everywhere. It happens to everybody. It's absolutely fine to take inspiration from other places, especially actually if that inspiration is from a place that you wouldn't expect. Like, if you look at a brand that has nothing to do with the kind of stuff that you're doing, that for some reason you like the kind of stuff that they're making and how they're putting it out there, and you can apply that in a different angle to the stuff that you're doing, absolutely do that. Of course do that.
Well, look, Jack, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Mate, it's an absolute joy. We'll have you back on. I think in terms of like summarising, you know, there's been some really interesting things that have come out today, specifically around, you know, experimentation and getting content out there and putting lots of different content out there and just seeing what sticks and what resonates. And I think the authenticity piece is critically important, and having and finding your own unique angle on what your perspective on your content is. And I think finally that consistency point is really interesting as well, in terms of showing up for your audience, constantly being out there. Mate, you know we love you.
It's been a pleasure just to look at you for that.
I know, this has been great. This is great for us. There's been some incredible insights that have come out in terms of, you know, just getting content out there. You know, it's clear you've built a career out of making content, that horrible word again, but you have made a career out of it. And I think it stems from the fact that you have been fearless in terms of just putting content out there and seeing what sticks and what resonates. And I think that is incredibly empowering advice for the audience.
It's also coming from somebody who now, and I think always hasn't been, the most consistent in terms of making stuff, but I'm aware, having existed in that world, that consistency is absolutely key if you want to build it up from the beginning.
Oh, massively. Well, I'm getting that. You need to be there for your audience. You need to show up for your audience in a way. So authenticity, consistency, and just getting stuff out there and trial and error, and be prepared for things not to go quite the way you want them to, and then also be prepared. That's fine, and also be prepared that some stuff that you might think is not necessarily particularly interesting or doesn't have a particular angle, and it might end up getting picked up for whatever reason.
Yeah,
you just don't know, and it's an experimentation process, I guess.
It's almost like I want to say, like, don't think about it too hard.
Okay,
like just if something's in your head about the way that you want to try it, just try it. In fact, I just made something recently which was kind of a loose experiment in terms of I'm going to say yes to everything that happens.
Yeah.
Because we didn't quite know how it was going to go. And I actually think we turned out with something really kind of interesting that we couldn't have planned for.
Great.
And I think that's been a lesson even for myself recently of like, just keep it. You don't have to have such a structured idea of what it needs to be. Just let it kind of happen and see how it goes.
Well, I think that's what we're also trying that with this podcast, how to build a brand. This is only episode 2. We are doing this to...
I can't believe I wasn't the first episode.
I know. Well, Richard Alford was.
This is bullshit. Oh, Richard, fine. I'll let him off.
What's he got to say? A lot.
With his radio voice.
Yeah.
I've still got voice notes on my phone from when he did all the temporary voiceovers for ads that we've edited.
You never want that.
No, I love it. It's how I go to sleep. I put it on. I
think that's what we're doing with this pod, though. We're experimenting. We want to show our audience how to make content, and that frequently producing content is beneficial for building a brand, and to get people like yourself to distill down to them, your expertise and knowledge about building brands and building a personal brand like Jack Howard, but also the work that you do on behalf of other brands, commercial brands. Mm-hmm. But this is going to be an experimentation process from our point of view as well, in terms of, who knows what content from this podcast is going to resonate with our audiences. I think, I'm also keen to get the audience's view on what sort of guests we should have on. Mm-hmm. Who what are the sort of content creators or brand influencers we should get onto this podcast. I mean, by the way, if you've got any suggestions or recommendations for people that we should have on, let me know, because this is an ever-growing thing. This is a real experiment for us to build a brand and to distill down those expertise of building a brand for our audience.
Great. I will let you know. I'll have a think about it.
Have a think.
This isn't going to make it to the podcast.
No.
We'll have a think about it.
So look, thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions, guys, or any suggestions, or you want to hear certain things on the pod, let us know. We are open. This is a big experiment. But look, thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll be in touch.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.